are you going other places too? Oh, great.
Let's see, where have I been? I was in Bozeman. I started in Bozeman, and then went to Cody, Wyoming.
Cody, they have a nice museum
There, and then I was in Red Lodge actually when the flooding
Oh, you're kidding.
happened. So I spent a couple days making sandbags in Red Lodge.
Oh,
Um,
oh my gosh.
and then I went to Billings, and now I'm here, and I go to Virginia City tomorrow. Falls.
Oh, wow. You're going just every.
Driving anywhere they'll let me in to talk about Sarah.
All right.
Show up and talk about Sarah.
Oh, well, this will be interesting. Yeah.
Oh, I hope so.
Great.
I really tried.
Oh, yeah.
Try to keep people awake.
So now, how did you decide? You're probably going to say all this in your talk, but how did you decide to write about this topic?
You know, I came across her and there was so little written about her, and it just kind of went from there. It's, you know, she deserved a book.
Right?
Changed my life trying to write that book. So
Oh, really? Oh, I hope you talk a little bit.
I will. That's coming.
Oh, that's
Don't worry.
okay. Okay, don't want to get too far ahead. So, are you from Montana originally?
I'm not. I grew up in California, and my first summer in grad school, I had an opportunity to come to Montana, and that
And you
was it.
came?
That was it. I've been back most summers
Oh, you have?
since, except for the last couple of years.
Well, sometimes, you know, life happens, that's what they say, and that you can't get back.
124.
Yes.
I don't hear anything, Renan. What's going on?
That's because you've been playing sax too long.
So were you able to get to talk in Red Lodge? Or you couldn't do it because it was,
Their museum is fine. There was no flooding at the museum. Like the little downtown business core is okay. But people who work and volunteer there obviously were dealing with other things, so we just canceled it, and I filled a lot of sandbags. And,
Oh my gosh.
I'll go
Yeah.
back in like September.
boy, they made everybody
Lodge
do
last
this.
week?
Yes, Red Lodge is a tight community.
I loved it.
Yeah, it's great, yeah.
I had such a good time there. I mean, I was really lucky. The little house I was in wasn't in
Did you say the
danger.
preface about the mics, about the questions?
If you want to do repeat questions when you have questions, that's great. Yeah, I think it works better.
I can question repeat. I have a.
Check, 1, 2, check. Check, 1, 2, check, check. Test, 1, 2.
They always say, how do you not say 9 and 10? Which is like mind-blowing to see it as it was, because I got in on Thursday night, so I was there. I just left the day before yesterday.
Oh my gosh.
It was. Didn't matter which side it was.
No, usually it goes on people's left, but DM.
Julie?
Hold that and say.
Hold this and say a couple words for you. Oh, that's loud. That's good. We can, yeah, we got all of that. We're hot mic'd now.
Hot mic. So there's a mute on there that for the next few minutes you can mute it if you like.
Dark.
Dark on there. I'll hold on to it until then.
You got everything? You want any water?
I'll be good with that. I'll try and keep it at about like 45 minutes, because I mean, I want to go outside and do my thing.
Oh yeah, you won't miss that, but we'll, yeah, 45 minutes is perfect, and then that'll allow a little bit of time for book signing.
Really nice carving that's made.
I don't think we're gonna get a
Just
huge
dropping it.
crowd, because that happens on a beautiful Saturday.
Yeah,
I've never been so sad that I didn't.
absolutely.
I was confused.
I'm doing a
But
duo
because you were doing the talk
maybe
and we had so many.
on emposement and a memorial for a friend of mine that passed away. And I was practicing blood draw. As soon as he talked, I should
Well,
have
when I was driving to, I had to turn, the tour train was just coming out, and it was pretty
That's what Billy Strayhorn did.
Yeah, that's what the song is.
Well, I had to stand
I
on
said,
side.
okay.
Oh,
I didn't want to
well,
say
yeah, I have a habit of that my head really good. I thought about
I
bringing
did,
it.
I thought it was scheduled in Tom's.
I actually applied for grant money at this time.
And I'm gonna, I think I'm gonna do it as a duo. Tenor players.
So they say, you know, protect your eyes and your skin.
How about that?
Which I do. So I had to talk with them.
Oh, it went fine. They had just my phone to the muscle. So, I spent more time talking.
Do that, and then do this memorial. And then I don't think till September. Sculpture. We did it last year.
Well, the money, I know, so
great to look out and see all the sculpture. And we were in the TV booth. Oh, really? Yeah. Set a stage up in there.
That's awesome.
Well, there was that movie that really, maybe
like mine,
they did talk about
we were like an average of like 10 years.
because
What do you think about it?
oh yeah, his life is really interesting.
Are you announcing?
I'm going to introduce. Oh, so I'm not mic'd.
And if you'll unmute. You guys all right? Need anything?
I think we're good.
Feel like we're ready to handle it.
Give me the thumbs up when the video is on. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming out on this lovely Saturday before Juneteenth. We're delighted to kick off our Juneteenth event today with Laura Arata. And as you know, we have 3 events today. We have Laura's talk, we have a Juneteenth ceremony, and a African American history tour train happening at 4. And I'm delighted right now to dive right into local Montana African American history. And Laura is here today after much planning. She is the Associate Professor of History and Director of Public History at Oklahoma State University. She is the author of Race in the Wild West, Sarah Bickford, the Montana Vigilantes, and the Tourism of Decline, 1870 to 1930. The book explores the life of fascinating Virginia City resident Sarah Bickford, the nation's first African-American female public utilities owner and heritage tourism entrepreneur. So Laura is finally very excited to be here in Montana with us, where the book began and is set, and she is going to talk about this really important and overlooked piece of Montana history. Thank you, and welcome, Laura.
Yes, thank you. We'll talk excitedly and with jazz hands. It's been a long time coming. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon. This is a great turnout. I am so excited to be back at MHS to talk about Sarah Bickford. I'm going to show quite a few pictures of Virginia City in this presentation, and of course Sarah Bickford lived in Virginia City, but this book wouldn't have been possible without MHS and the archival collections here and the many, many, many hours that I spent digging through them looking for tiny little snippets of information with some very patient and very caring archivists who helped me along that research journey as I was just starting to learn how to do that sort of work. So this is a special place for me, and it's the first time I've been able to be back since the book came out, which was, of course, smack in the middle of COVID, right? So this is a very exciting day. So thank you for taking a few minutes to come in and sit and listen. I'm going to try and keep this to about 45 minutes, and hopefully we'll have time for some good questions. And then I hear there's ice cream outside. I will hype that at the very end, so you'll have a reminder that that's coming. So I'm super delighted to be here, and Race in the Wild West is very much a book I always like to open, and someone was asking me just before we started about how I came to write this book, so I got you covered. We'll talk about it now. It very much became a book about the Wild West that I had grown up knowing and loving, and also a book about me exploring the ways that that West was different than what I'd been taught growing up as a kid. So just to give you a little bit of quick context, I always like to start this talk by just centering what I thought of as the Wild West, because it's so important to this story. So this is my grandfather, John Arata. This is a picture I found actually quite a long time, probably over a decade after he had passed, in kind of a box of stuff. But this is very much how I thought of him when I was growing up. You can see our ranch in the background that we lived on. We raised cattle and hay and grain, so even when I was growing up, that was very much the rhythms of my life, were raising things and sewing grain sacks and baling hay. Slinging some sandbags in Red Lodge last week very much was like a throwback to some grain sack action. It was calling up some muscle memory from long, long ago. And so the West that I grew up in, we were on the Central Coast in California. It was about halfway between San Francisco to the north, and then Santa Cruz was about another, just a little under an hour to the south. And it was this interesting dichotomy of me growing up on a farm where we didn't have TV, and we had like a telephone that was on a party line until I was, I think, 4 or 5, like an old rotary telephone, you know. That's a skill the youth of today are confused by. And so it was this interesting place where we were still farming with a team of horses, and I was still helping milk cows by hand a lot of the time. But then my nearest neighbor flew in and out to work in a helicopter every day because he worked in Silicon Valley, right? So it was this very oddly changing place. And I grew up with these ideas then about what that West must have been like before Silicon Valley happened, before all this change happened, before the place I was living in became very different. But just for street cred, right? Here's my grandpa on a big shiny horse. Here is an actual photograph of Laura with just, I think this picture illustrates pretty well like the reckless abandon of youth that I took into trying to write Sarah Bickford's story. That horse threw me into a fence at the end of this run. Back has never been the same, but that was our best run, so there's like a lot of life lessons, right, wrapped up in there. But so just want to start there, that I very much grew up in this world, right, with my ideas about what the Wild West was supposed to be, and a lot of those were shaped by things like John Wayne movies and the Roy Rogers show. I think we had some Hopalong Cassidy. Like, we didn't have TV, but we had some Westerns on VHS tape. And so those were all the ideas I carried with me the first time I came to Montana, which was in 2007. I had just started grad school. I really had no idea what I was doing in grad school. I was just kind of going along with it, trying to figure out what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. I knew I really liked history, but I didn't really know how I was going to apply that to a job. But in the summer of 2007, I had the opportunity to go to Virginia City, Montana for 2 weeks to attend a little public history field school that Washington State University had organized. And this is, I think, the first picture of me that was taken in Virginia City. We were helping to remove some layers of flooring from an old building that you can still see. Who's been to Virginia City? Oh, good, a bunch of enthusiastic hands. So this is in the Kramer building on the far end of Wallace Street, that little building that's interpreted as a dress shop now. Yeah, so that's inside. And it was just such a beautiful moment of realizing, like, this was history I could hold, I could, feel it in my hands, and I could explore it in all these different ways. And it was really meaningful. So this is one of the first pictures I took of Wallace Street in Virginia City, and I remember, walking down this little kind of rickety sidewalk, as you do in Virginia City, and looking at all these old buildings, and feeling like, okay, I've stepped back into exactly what I think the Wild West would have been. It feels exactly like that nostalgia that I grew up with. Like, all of a sudden, it was kind of already ruined for me growing up in California. Like, San Francisco and some of the other cities had grown up so quickly around our farm that it was kind of a rapidly changing world when I was a kid. So walking back into Virginia City felt like, here it is, right? Here's the place I've always wanted to see. So we'll come back to this photo in a few minutes, but that's where my journey got started. And so now to bring us around to Sarah Bickford, I was like anyone else, wandering around Virginia City, wanting to look inside all these cool old buildings that had been preserved. And I remember walking into what's interpreted as the Hangman's Building, which I assume a lot of you said you've been to Virginia City, so I assume a lot of you have been there, and these will be pretty familiar pictures. It hasn't changed that much. But there was this one page, just one 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper that talked about Sarah Bickford and her remarkable story. And I remember reading that and thinking, like, well, there's got to be like more of a story here. I would like to know more about this person. And there just wasn't a lot available. But there was a lot in this building if you walk around, and it's still pretty much what it looks like today. There's a little desk that they're kind of interpreting as the water company. It was her business office for a long time. And then, of course, there's a lot of monuments to the vigilantes. Like, you want to know why it's called the Hangman's Building. You want to know what went on there. So there's different things, interpreting some members of the vigilantes and talking about the vigilante oath. And then, of course, the little diorama. I assume who's seen the little diorama? Probably, yeah, a few of you have seen the little diorama. Depicting the events, like what happened in this building in January of 1864. And of course, the famous story is there was lawlessness that was happening in the territory, and there were other men who decided enough was enough. They had to do something about this lawlessness. And so the vigilantes of Montana executed, I believe it's 22 people in 37 days in their initial trials and rounding up of suspects that were committing robbery and road agency and murder, different crimes. So there's a famous instance where 5 men are hanged side by side in this building, and it's one of those really fascinating twists of history that the building is still there and you can still go see that space. So I remember being pretty struck by the dioramas here. Her desk is here in the back, and at the time there was a mannequin who, I don't think the mannequin is still there, but all the rest of this is. And so he's okay, well, there's a connection between African American people and the history of this building, and it was a little bit glossed over in the interpretation at that point. It kind of sounded like Sarah Bickford just happened to be in this building. And so I wanted to know more about that story and how it was that an African American woman came to have her desk in her business office right under this beam where 5 people were lynched, and you can still see the rope burns in the wood to this day. And I thought there has to be more of a story there. But I couldn't get at it. But so long story short, I fell in love with Virginia City, right? Immediately, I had to leave after 2 weeks. And actually, I went off to Alaska after that. I did an internship in Alaska for the rest of the summer. And I got off the plane coming back from Alaska and was like, get out of my way. I have to get back to Virginia City. That is the place I have been happiest in the longest time. So I went back every summer for many summers after that and started digging through some of the archival collections they had that were just kind of in storage that hadn't really even been processed yet. And I wrote a whole master's thesis called Embers of the Social City, which if you're curious, there's a copy in this building somewhere, extant, I think even a hard copy. We were being fancy about it. But so long story short, that was like a 300-page master's thesis about everything in Virginia City that I was fascinated by, the businesses and the kinds of things people were buying and how the town survived for such a long time while it was in decline. Embers of the Social City comes from a great quote that was in the first full-length written history of Montana in 1885. Or a contemporary in 1885 said, well, Virginia City's been spoken of as dead and crooning over the embers of departed glory. I thought, what a great quote. Love that. So I put it in everything that I write about Virginia City. So the average length for a master's thesis is about 80 pages. Like I said, mine was about 300 pages long. Got a little excited. But in all of that 300 pages, Sarah Bickford ended up in a footnote because I didn't have more information about her other than that, like, page that was on the wall in Virginia City. I thought, okay, so as we were getting past the master's thesis, and someone had suggested, well, maybe you could get a PhD. And I thought, well, that's hilarious. Those are for smart people. It never occurred to me to think about getting a PhD. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, like that footnote is just pissing me off. Like, I'm so mad that Sarah Bickford is stuck in a footnote, and she deserves more than a footnote. And so maybe if I got a PhD, I could write Sarah Bickford out of a footnote. She deserved that. She deserved to have this story told. And I remember kind of the genesis of that conversation. It was here. Actually, I was here doing research and like frantically digging through things upstairs, and it was Molly, I believe, was the editor of Montana Magazine of Western History at the time, and she was like, girl, you have to leave this building. And we're like going to get lunch. She dragged me out, I think by the collar, and like tucked me in her car and took me to lunch. And I remember her asking, like, okay, a whole dissertation? Why do you want to do a whole dissertation on Sarah Bickford? Why is it important to you? And I remember sitting there in Molly Holtz's car and saying, because she's a Black woman promoting tourism at the site of a lynching, and there has to be a story there. Like, she didn't accidentally wind up doing that. I don't believe that. All the things I know about her, she was very intentional. So there's got to be a way I can tell that story. And I think Molly bought me lunch and was like, good luck, my sweet baby bird. Do your best. But it's going to be an uphill road, which I want to talk about just really quickly. It is hard to research African American women, especially, and those are not the only figures in history that it's challenging to find, of course, but we do have to sometimes overcome some extra challenges because there may be a double marginalization in the record of being marginalized for race and then also being marginalized for gender, and that sometimes makes it a challenge. We have to look for those little traces in the sources, that little piece of information that gives us just enough, right, to make it on to the next step. So I kind of decided pretty early on, like, if I'm going to have limited information about Sarah or from Sarah personally, I know I can at least reconstruct the world around her. I've already been doing that with my master's thesis, and it's this amazing phenomena of historical research that when you start looking into a place and you get that immersed in it, you kind of start to feel like you know the people who lived there. So I decided I was going to do that. I was going to write a story about Sarah Bickford. I wasn't quite sure how I was going to do it. But I was really struck that African Americans did keep popping up in all these early histories of Montana that I was looking at. And it's a well-known story today. African Americans, I don't think, have ever been more than 1% of Montana's total population over time. That's been pretty true. Numbers of African American settlers grew in the 1870s and 80s, but so did the total population of Montana, right? So it stayed at about 1%. But we find little mentions of African American settlers doing things like participating in gold strikes, the gold strike that founded Helena, for example. There's traces of an African American person. They're operating lots of different kinds of businesses, including things like barbershops early on, and that's one occupation that's pretty lucrative, if you can go into it. There's a few different ways that African Americans popped up in early stories of the vigilantes that I was really fascinated by. I assume this crowd is pretty familiar with the Montana Vigilantes. Is that a fair assessment? No one is thrown by mention of the vigilantes. So some of their early precursor to vigilante actions were miners' court trials of different men who had been accused of doing bad things. And there's a famous episode that slipped into Thomas Dimsdale, the first history of the vigilantes, where he says they were having a miners' court and they were having trouble deciding on the vote, so they had two groups of men go different directions and stand there to count votes. And people physically would walk through them to record their vote for guilty or not guilty. And there's a black man who's caught voting more than once. And Dimsdale writes about this. His exact words there was an Irish miner who finally shouted out hey, there's this, I won't repeat that word, but who voted 3 times. And he's probably not the only one, right? And I think Dimsdale's response to this is interesting, where he says, well, and then, so that guy ran off and some other guys ran off and that was the end of it. We don't know what happened. So I'm I have a lot of questions, right? And this is 1863. We don't have a census for Virginia City. I have no way of knowing exactly who was in Virginia City. But if I look at pioneer diaries and reminiscences and letters and little snippets of things, again, that are upstairs in this very building, there's other early residents who mention, there was a black man who lived in town. And one of the rumors about vigilantes is always, maybe some of it was political. Right? A lot of the vigilantes are supporters of the Union, and a lot of the guys who get lynched are Confederate supporters or Copperheads. People who are in support of the Union, men like Wilbur Fisk Sanders, right, big name, are more likely to lean radical Republican in that time and support black voting rights. So maybe it makes sense to us that there's a black man voting in some of those early trials and not being explicitly called out for it at first. So there's more to that story. So the question of African American rights at this moment, when all of this is happening, is not decided yet. And that's another crucial part of this story. So we have kind of this early tension between the rights African Americans are going to have in Montana when it's created versus all those same old patterns, existing patterns of race and exclusion that exist in other parts of the country. I'm not going to talk too much about Juneteenth because there's a whole other program happening right after this that's going to talk about Juneteenth, and I didn't want to step on any toes for that. But just one real quick comparison. So we have that early episode of a black man who's caught voting at an early vigilante trial, which again, I think that is telling. The fact that he's able to vote at all is telling, and that Dimsdale is not really looking sideways that happened. He just thinks he's telling a funny story, but the truth underlying that story is interesting. In 1864, when the Organic Act creating Montana is pushed through Congress, there's a big debate. There are some people in Congress who say, well, if we're going to create this new territory and we're in the middle of fighting this bloody civil war, a big question of which is the rights of African American people, then they should have suffrage. If they're going to be citizens, the right of suffrage would accompany that. And it's actually Nathaniel Pitt Langford, another authority on vigilantes, who's the source, who says, well, there's a very respected person in the territory who's a Negro person. It's worth $50,000. He earns that nickname. And in the end, Congress kind of glosses over this issue and says, well, it's an academic question. There's no more African Americans in the territory. We'll let the state decide. And the Bannock legislature does, the next year, prohibit African American voting rights. So we have that moment of indecision. So to come back to the book for a few minutes, there are kind of two quotes or two sentiments that shaped this research journey. And I just want to talk about them both briefly because they help kind of get at or unravel the story of how this book came to be. One, and this is a composite of several different people who said this to me over time, including one of my advisors, with the best of intention, but people who were just concerned that I was now on this mission to write a story of a single African American person in Montana, and they're just like worried that I wouldn't find the sources. So this idea that you will never find the sources to write that book, you're gonna have to think about shifting gears if you wanna finish this PhD. You're gonna have to think of a way to broaden your topic. Very much ran up against me being stubborn and in my early 20s, right? But just to give us a sense of the kinds of sources that I did have, and this will become important again in a few minutes, we did have things like this, right? So Sarah Bickford, when she first arrived in Montana, her name was Sarah Blair, and she married someone named John Brown, so her name became Sarah Brown. She used the nickname Sally for a lot of the 19th century, and that was a really common nickname for Sarah. And so I have little, snippets of her. So here she's running the New City Bakery and Restaurant, and she's making, you can see, fresh bread, cakes, pies, and confectionery constantly on hand, and she's serving meals, and that would have been pretty common occupation for African American women at the time. So this is great, right? It tells me some things. It puts her in Virginia City, and I have a sense of what she's doing, but how do I write a whole book? Right? How do you write a whole book out of just little pieces of the puzzle like this? But where everything kind of started to unravel in the best way, right, and help me ask new questions. I had won a little grant to go to Tennessee and do some research, and the suspicion was always that Sarah came from either Tennessee or North Carolina. And I really wanted to pin that down. Like, if I could figure out where she was from, then at least I could try and trace her steps. At least I could try and connect this whole story. And I remember walking into that archive. They were not as patient with me as Montana Historical Society, but I mean, we worked through it. But I remember walking in and saying, hello. I am looking for this single girl who I think was from this part of Tennessee. I think she was a slave. I think this family may have owned her. Help me find Sarah. And you could kind of see the light drain out of that archivist's eyes for just a second. Like, oh, this is going to be such a long day for me. But bless her, right? She started pulling stuff, and actually, she got really into it with me. We were then on a mission together. Because one of the first things we found, so this is Jonesboro, Tennessee. Sarah often used the name Blair, and the name Blair was in her divorce record. So, of course, I want to trace that name back. And the census taker of Jonesboro, Tennessee, decided he was going to record African American people on Schedule 1 in 1860. That's crucial. In 1860, there's still two censuses. There's Schedule 1, which is free people. It's like the census we see today, where it records your name and your age and your race and where you're from and your occupation and a little bit of like demographic information about you. And then there's Schedule 2, and Schedule 2 is the slave census. And Schedule 2 recorded 4 things. It recorded age, color, sex, and a dollar value, right? So you get a sense just from that, it's supposed to be a little bit dehumanizing, right? It's supposed to record, it's a property record, essentially. I can look at Schedule 2 all day, and I might find candidates who could be Sarah, but I have no real way of putting a name to one of those lines. But William Crouch, again, bless him, decided that he was going to record all of the black inhabitants of Jonesboro on Schedule 1. I think maybe because East Tennessee had been kind of a hotbed of abolitionist sentiment. One of the earliest abolitionist newspapers in the country actually comes from this area, from a guy who's a close business partner of the Blair family, which owned Sarah. So we see all those really interesting complications of American history in there. And you see what happened here. So here's Sarah Blair. She's 8 years old, right? He's recorded all the same information he's recording for every other inhabitant, and then he's made himself another little column with an S in it. And I assume that stands for slave, because then you can see somebody else has come in and crossed this out, and it's a little hard to see, but they've written Schedule 2 in the margin right here. So then you just get some chills and you cry a little bit with your new archivist friend, and you say, okay, I mean, what are the odds, right? That this one single person that I'm looking for, I would manage to find. And just as a side note, this becomes a Wild West story too, because John Blair, who owned Sarah when she was a child, was a congressman. He was in United States Congress. He was a bitter political enemy of Davy Crockett, which I find really amusing in that sort of Wild West nostalgia storytelling kind of way, right? When Crockett gets up in Congress after failing to win re-election and says, y'all can go to hell, I'm going to Texas, he's talking to John Blair. What a fun story of where Sarah Bickford started and the kinds of stories she would have been immersed in growing up. So there she was, right? And then once I'd found her, I was able to trace this journey across the country. And I think it really does help to see it, right? This is a long way to travel. She's probably about 14 or 15 when she goes west in 1870. So just getting that far across the country at that age with, right, some people she probably doesn't know very well, coming to this brand new place. And the stories she would have been hearing about Montana, if people in Tennessee are talking about it, right, are probably a mix of big gold strike, still scared of Native American people, like that's a lot in the press in Tennessee, this fear of Native people, founded or not. Vigilantes, right? Those actions are certainly being talked about back east. And then she might have been hearing little echoes of African American people might have the opportunity for some more rights there. So that tells us a lot of things about her story. The other quote that really shaped this book, and this again was, a couple of different people, but one instance in particular that I remember when I was just feeling kind of stuck and I was like, I don't know, maybe I can't find enough sources. Maybe I took on too much. And another one of my advisors at Washington State had said, well, but I can tell you really care about her, though. And if you care that much and it means that much to you, just go ahead and try and write that story. We'll see what happens. And I can tell you about one really specific and still gives me a lot of feelings turning point in this. So I'd kind of given up a little bit. I thought, I've probably found as many sources as I'm going to find about Sarah. Maybe I'm going to have to reconfigure what I'm doing. And that little 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. It was in the Hangman's Building the first time I went to Virginia City. Talked about that she, in her first marriage, had 3 children and all of them had died. It was well known that her daughter named Ava had died in 1881. That was documented. But she had 2 sons. And nobody knew what her sons' names were or any of the details about them. And I was looking for something else. This is how it always happens. This was back in the days when the microfilm machine was my friend. Things had not been digitized on the internet yet. And I was working on an article about tourism that was based on the Vigilante Trail and the Nez Perce Trail. And I wanted to explore how those events went from being these scary, terrifying, right, things that happened into being a safe place for tourism, where now you can go out and you can drive the Nez Perce Trail or the Vigilante Trail and you get some history along the way and some context. And it's, right, a thriving. I was just driving on the Nez Perce Trail on my way into Helena, actually. And I'll be on the Vigilante Trail tomorrow as I head into Virginia City. So this is still part of your experience, just being in Montana. And so you can see here, this is 1877. I was looking through the newspaper for little remnants of people talking about the flight of the Nez Perce in 1877. That was the mission I was on, which is probably why it struck me. And I ran across this little obituary. And this is all it says, right? Brown. In this city on Monday, December 24th, 1877, James Leonard, son of Mr. and Mrs. John Brown, aged 2 years and 6 weeks. Oh, wait for it. Hold that thought. Maybe get some tissues out, because... So I actually had the census next to me, and so I'm immediately searching through, are there any other Browns in Virginia City? Is there anybody else this could be other than Sarah? There wasn't. And I remember sitting there just like having chills a little bit and saying, okay, well, this is her son's obituary. His name is James Leonard, right? So if I write this story, I can give James Leonard back his name. I can say really definitively as I write this book, James Leonard Brown was Sarah Bickford's son from her first marriage, and this is when he died. And the other moment that this was it, right? This was a definitive turning point in writing this book. You note here, Christmas Eve, his death. Sarah Bickford always gave her birthday as December 25th, okay? And then I want you to just think about this for a second. This is 1877. In 1880, here she is on the census with Eva, who's still living. Her daughter Eva's going to live a couple more months. She gave her age as 24. I mean, she's about 21, right? 21 when James Leonard dies. And I remember sitting there thinking, okay, well, I am about 24. And I mean, my life was not always easy. Growing up on a ranch, faced being in poverty and having certain kinds of challenges that I had to overcome. But I cannot even imagine being 24 and living that much of a life. She's grown up in slavery. She's traveled all the way across the country alone, pretty much, when she's young. She gets married. Her first husband is really abusive. We know that from her divorce records pretty definitively. She has 3 children in that marriage. All of them die young. And then she's on her own in Montana, right? We can recap just this first decade of her life in Montana territory. She has another son, I believe his name is William, but I've not really been able to find him. I suspect he was maybe a twin of James Leonard that was stillborn. So that's just the best evidence I was able to put together, right? But then I look over something like this and say, okay, she went through all of that. 1881 comes, all of her children have died. She's finally won a divorce, which is a big deal, actually, in 1881. She's on her own. She's totally free. And I know that she has the ability to travel because she goes back to Tennessee at that point. She goes home and visits. And the Virginia City newspaper reports on it and says she's headed out of town on the stagecoach. She'll be back. And she is. She comes back a few months later, and that has to mean something, right? She chose to return to Montana. She clearly had other decisions she could have made. And so there we pick up a different chapter in her story, and it gets much happier after this, fortunately. So 1883, she marries Stephen Bickford. By all accounts, they have a really solid partnership. They work together well. They support each other. They have 4 children, all of whom live and outlive their parents and go on to do other things, so that gets much happier. Stephen dies in 1900, and by that point, he's owned 2/3 shares of the Virginia City Water Company for about 12 years, and he leaves those 2/3 shares to Sarah. And she's probably been running the company for a lot of that time, because Stephen is off mining for a lot of their marriage. So there's a moment now, right, where 1900, she's becoming the first Black female public utilities owner in the nation, and she's really deliberate about how she runs that company, and she's really successful at it. At a time when it's hard in Virginia City, the population is declining, all those kinds of public service jobs are getting really hard to sustain. One of my favorite comparisons is that Virginia City gets telephone service pretty early, like 1910, 1911, they have telephone wires run into Virginia City. And people get telephones, and then the telephone service gets shut off because they can't find anybody to maintain the equipment. It's too expensive. Nobody can make it work with the population base. So there's other public services and public utilities that are not managing to get through those times. And Sarah is. She's finding a way to make it work. So I wanted to know more about this moment, right? When does she acquire this building called the Hangman's Building, and is it kind of accidental, as it was implied? And my conclusions ended up being that it were not. She acquired it in 1917. Automobile traffic is on the rise. She had her choice of empty buildings in Virginia City at that point. There are other things she could have purchased. She, as a side note, buys it from a man who had been a vigilante himself and who was talking about, I think we should tear this down, because any day the railroad is going to come to Virginia City, and then we're going to need a big new tourist hotel because this resurgence will happen, which is always the hope, right? The railroad's going to come through, or something is going to change, and there's going to be this whole new tide of settlement to Virginia City. And it's continuously disappointed. That's why I ended up calling it the tourism of decline. But she knew what she was doing there. And so she's going to be in that building until her death in 1931. And it really is this interesting convergence of a Black woman who's very much aware of Black history, subscribes to African American periodicals, takes her children to Butte. There's a, much more developed African American community in Butte or Helena than there is in Virginia City. And Sarah's really vocal with her daughters, especially, about wanting them to interact with other African American people. In fact, one of my favorite stories about her is that one of her daughters had fallen in love with someone who her sister described as a Scotsman, a mining engineer who was a Scotsman. And Sarah's response to that is, okay, if you really love him, you can marry him, but first, I want you to go hang out with some other Black people and see what that has to offer you. Those are Sarah's exact words. I want you to see what people of your race have to offer. And so she packs all of the kids up and she takes them off to the World's Fair. And she takes them to Tennessee to visit friends. And lo and behold, her daughter ends up marrying a Black Seminole storekeeper and moving to Wewoka, Oklahoma, which is actually about 60 or 70 miles from where I live now, so small world. To do some more research on Virginia's life after that point. But so Sarah's certainly aware. She's certainly aware of things involving race. And I love that because I think it throws just a little bit of a wrench into our ideas of what the Wild West was supposed to be like, right? And the deeper point there for me always is that we're not losing anything from the Wild West by telling a story like Sarah Bickford. We're gaining another really interesting, really complicated, fascinating story about how people made their way in the West and made it their own and left their own imprint on it. And that is so important when we're talking about something like the Hangman's Building, right? And vigilante tourism, which is still super popular. It's everywhere in Montana. You know, that building probably wouldn't exist if not for her. And we should honor that, right? That deserves our attention. So just really quickly, I promised I would bring us back to the fun stuff, and I never get to talk about this in Sarah Bickford talks. So in honor of today, I did want to point out, and this is one of the things we talked about in organizing this talk, when settlers and pioneers are coming to Montana, right, it's always a quest to get those little things that remind you of home that are super hard to come by when you're on this rough and tumble mining frontier that's pretty isolated and off on its own for a little bit. And one of the things that pops up a lot, just if you read old newspapers, is ice cream. Like the fact that they have figured out how to make ice cream in Montana territory is a big deal when it happens. And a lot of times it's African American women who have the skills and the knowledge to do that. So we see this pop up over and over again. Just want to give you one example. This is not an African American business specifically. It's Brandt and Schneck, so they sound German to me, who are running, right, the Star restaurant in Virginia City. But you'll see down here, they're advertising an ice cream saloon. And this is July of 1865. So the fact that they have figured out like ice and freezing things and they're able to make ice cream appear in July of 1865, just for some perspective. So we're a year after all the vigilante executions, right? Like we are very much still in this frontier conditions, but ice cream has made it to Montana. And we see, right, so this is 1866. Here's Virginia City. Here's our main street. So there's some good building going on. Like they're really hoping to turn this into a permanent town. But the fact that a place like this is, right, developing all those little tastes of back home really speaks to the permanence and the stature that Virginia City is hoping to have. And we'll start seeing little advertisements like this. So Minerva Cogswell and her sister Parthenia, it's either Sneed or Swede. I've seen it spelled both ways. It's Swede in my book, but I think it might be Sneed. So it's another one of those, just there's more research we can do. So they're like Sarah. So these are black women who are living in Virginia City at the same time who are also making pies and cakes and breads. And it's Minerva and Parthenia and Sarah, actually, who provide ice cream for the Virginia City 4th of July celebrations in the 1870s and 80s. And I thought that was just such a neat connection for a day like today, right? Where we're talking about Juneteenth, we're also getting ready for the 4th of July. It's not too far off. So you can see here, 1876, ice cream and suitable refreshments on the evening at like the 4th and in the evening at the Old International Hotel. This is another one of my favorite little snippets. Minerva and her sister brought a bunch of ice cream to the newspaper office, and the editor waxed poetic about this for like many, many lines. Just, they brought me ice cream, and it was amazing. You should eat their ice cream. It was really good. It's like he goes on for a while about it. And just to go back to this picture, right, this is 1877. Here's the International Hotel, right here. You can just, it actually runs into several of these buildings. Just you get a sense, this is the town around it, right? But the ice cream, they've made it work. It's pretty impressive. And I thought this is why I was digging around looking for a couple images last night, and this popped up. So this is from the Helena newspaper from 1878, advertising Dr. Price's special flavorings, vanilla, lemon, right, for flavoring ice cream, cakes, and pastry. And that gives us just another little fun sense. This is from Chicago. So the kinds of places that Montana communities are connected with and getting these little tastes of home, actually, I think is kind of fun. So Sarah Bickford. Just kind of final notes, and then I'll wrap it up. In 1888, the Pioneer Association of Montana, of which her husband is a member, but she is not. He arrived in 1862, she arrived in 1870. There's a lot of debate about the cutoff date for Montana Pioneers Association at that time. But during the 1888 celebrations, which are actually held over the 4th of July in Virginia City, Sarah provides ice cream. She opens up an ice cream saloon. And one of my suspicions is that maybe it was actually in the Hangman's Building, because there's a little note from the 1901 newspaper that says that building had served as a pill shop, reading room, post office, meat market, ice cream parlor, and half a dozen other things. I wonder, I'm probably never going to be able to prove it, but it's fun to wonder about. So I love this convergence, right, of a Montana pioneer story of Sarah and her husband Stephen, and the ice cream that she is supplying on the 4th of July to all these Montana pioneers who are reminiscing about the things that took place in the territory early on. And they're very much looking at things like, right, the building in which the vigilantes hanged 5 men. They're not quite calling it the Hangman's Building yet. One of my suspicions in the book is that Sarah's the one who actually gives it that nickname. She's trying to bring people into it. But we get a sense that history is very present. And then we can ask a lot of interesting questions about why Sarah Bickford chooses that moment to buy this building and promote tourism there. And it's all sort of coming together at the end of the 19th century. So of 1890, the frontier is declared closed. Massive anxiety. What are Americans going to do? We don't have a frontier to push into anymore. And that's been such a consistent part of the country's identity for so long, right? Guys like Davy Crockett, who are off pushing into that frontier, right, at an earlier time. Post-World War I, we have a lot of improvements to the highway system. Automobile tourism's expanding. Suddenly, if you're in a car, you can get a lot more places in Montana than you could when you're limited to like train and stagecoach service. We're also in that crucial moment of the development of Wild West shows and literature about the West and really early movies about the West. And Americans are thinking about it and thinking about that nostalgia in some really interesting ways. Painters like Charlie Russell, right? We're surrounded by great examples of how Americans are envisioning the West at this point. So Sarah's really able to move in on this moment when places that can claim authentic tourism, authentic relics of the Wild West suddenly have that added, right, allure to them. People want to come see the real thing, right? We don't want to go see a reconstruction. We want to go see something that is decrepit, that looks like it's been through some stuff, and walk down that creaking old sidewalk and look at those old buildings and kind of revel in how things survived. So she's able to be a part of that. And you can see this is a picture from 1939. It's taken for the Farm Security Administration. But how Virginia City is marketing itself, right, as the cradle of Montana history, the place where it all began, the place where the conditions that allowed for the creation of this territory happened. And here we get now, it's formally, right, identified as the Hangman's Building. And I've always been struck by this. So here's the little Virginia City Water Company office sign. And then if we look at these 2 signs, which are actually still there, they're like hanging up in the building, that has a list of who was hanged there, and it's the same lettering on both of these. So probably they're made by the same person. So this tells me a lot, right, about how this building is being portrayed. And there's a great little apocryphal story about Sarah that I've never been able to prove, but it's a great example of the legends of this tourism. There's always stories that she would like keep a coil of rope under her desk, and she's the one who installs a trap door in the ceiling so she can open it up and control when people can look at the beam. It was actually covered over before she took over the building, and she's the one who exposes it. So that's a very intentional action, right? So the story is that she would, open the beam for people. She would keep a coil of rope under her desk, and as they're on the way out, she's like, snip, snip, 10 cents. It's the original rope, which I can't prove, but I can see her doing. So It's a fun story to think about. And so all that brings us kind of back to this tourism of decline and the lure of Western history, which is still there. I mean, it is so present, right? And I want to just come back to a second for where I started, right? Because I wandered down a street in Virginia City for the first time with all those ideas that were sold to me by Louis L'Amour books and Tony Hillerman books and movies and TV shows about what the Wild West was supposed to be. And telling a story like Sarah's in the midst of that didn't take anything away, right, from my imagination or from all those things that I envisioned the West as having been. But it did give me something so important, right? It gave me a whole new perspective and another way to look at this history in other ways. And it's a great testament to how things come full circle. So my very first college class as a tiny, scared little undergraduate, 18 years old, at the University of Washington was with a professor named Quinard Taylor, who I didn't know it at the time, but he's one of the premier historians, leading historians of African American history in the West. And he just taught it as History 101, right? It was just a class like any other. I'd like to think it opened up my thinking a little bit, maybe, on some new kinds of stories. When I was thinking about embarking on this PhD journey, I had emailed him and asked him for a letter of recommendation for grad school and told him I was thinking about writing about Sarah Bickford. And he declined to write me a letter of recommendation because he couldn't remember me, which was fair. But he did send me everything he had about Sarah Bickford, which was only a couple pages. It wasn't much. But he was very encouraging, and just as kind of a fun full circle side note, he's actually the series editor of the volume set that Race in the Wild West is part of. So I love that way of thinking about it too, right? I walked into his classroom and he taught me something and I hopefully learned from it, and now I hope I'm paying that forward. So untold doesn't mean untellable, and I love this quote just to wrap up from a contemporary of Sarah who was in Idaho at the time. William J. McConnell said, "History is relentless. Once made, it cannot be unmade." And I think that is such a fitting, right, way of summarizing the way we think about stories and the way we think about the past. We're getting ready to celebrate Juneteenth and the 4th of July. Those dates are both about freedom. They're both about our interpretations of American freedom and what those big ideals, right, of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness meant to people over time. And just what a wonderful opportunity, right, to reflect on how that might have looked different to different people, but it's all part of our shared American story. And I'll leave you on a happy note about history being relentless. So I just got done. I'm supposed to get to see the final product in a couple of days, maybe, while I'm here. The Extreme History Project in Bozeman and North by Northwest Films have partnered to make a little documentary about 4 incredible Montana women, one of whom is Sarah Bickford. And I was honored to be a part of that, and I love this shot of the Hangman's Building in its current state. And I'll be there tomorrow, talking excitedly about all of this. And here's our really wonderful living history interpreter striding into the building to get some shots to tell Sarah's story. So that's coming. It's called The Story of Us. I'm sure it will have a premiere in Helena, so I encourage everybody to see it when it's available, and just really look forward to getting to share this incredible story. And so I want to leave it here. After the book came out, I was able to be in touch with a couple of Sarah Bickford's grandchildren, and they were so generous and so kind, and they sent me a few pictures of Sarah that I hadn't yet seen. So here's one of the last pictures I think we have of her, about 1929 or 1930, standing outside the water company office. I'm still trying to figure out if this is a phonograph or a smudge, and someday I will come to a determination, maybe. And here's me receiving my PhD. And I just always like to conclude here. I mean, I think this is such a good example of uniquely American stories and diverse American stories and the promise of the American West. You know, Sarah Bickford wasn't supposed to end up where she ended up. She was born in slavery. She was supposed to end up on Schedule II. That was supposed to be her life in the late 1850s when she was a child. Starting where I started out, right? I had some privileges in some ways. I also had some challenges in other ways. We were really poor. There was never any expectation that I was going to go to college, let alone grad school, let alone, like, what the heck is a PhD? I'm still figuring out what a PhD means, honestly. But what a beautiful story about starting in a place and getting to somewhere that you couldn't have imagined when you were young. And I love that because it gives me that sense of, I think maybe Sarah and I thought about the West in a similar way, spread really far apart by time, and in my case, being influenced by all that great nostalgia that emerged out of the West. You know, but that's the power of the West, that it gives us that kind of vague but really persistent sense that I can be someone. I just have to find, right, my place in this bigger story. So I love to end there. I hope it gives us all, right, just some room for reflection about what the West and what learning these kinds of stories can mean for all of us. So I will wrap it up there. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you so much for coming. I have no idea how long I've talked. Hopefully we're okay on time.
Our clock is broken.
Our clock is broken. Nobody was throwing things at me. So.
Yeah, about 15 minutes for questions. And then please, Laura's book is for sale in the bookstore, and she'll be available outside the bookstore for signing too. But questions first.
Please.
I have one question. Sarah married, her second marriage was to Mr. Bickford. You have of him appears that he is a white man.
Mm-hmm.
So in fact, they were their children. Yet she was very adamant in her own way that daughters would marry the black community, even though it could have done either way. In other words, she diverted her one daughter from marrying the Scotsman. It's interesting. How do you, what are your takes on that?
It's a great question. So the question is about Sarah's clearly in an interracial marriage, and actually her first marriage is also interracial. So the question is about her children and their identity as African American, right, or mixed race. And it's such an important question, and I spend a lot of the book wrestling that there's a reason the book ended up being called Race and the Wild West, not just the Sarah Bickford story, right? Because it's all, we have to talk about it in this context of race being tricky and complicated. Let's back up a second. Her first husband is a man named John Brown. He's an Irish immigrant, so he may not have fully been considered, white by the terms we would think of it today in 1872 when they got married. Irish identity is still evolving and changing, and there's all those unsettled questions coming out of the Civil War of race and belonging and identity, and it becomes part of this, right, much bigger, very deeply American story that we're still having lots of conversations about. So by the time she's in her second marriage, and Stephen Bickford is from Maine, right? He has, I think his ancestry is like English and German, maybe. One of his daughters talks a little bit about some French ancestry. So he's, through and through from that sort of traditional understanding of what white in America means. And it does give us a lot to think about that Sarah Bickford's children all feel kind of pressured over time to identify one way or the other. There's also a lot of talk about Sarah Bickford herself being mixed race that I did investigate when I was writing the book and was never able to really pin down, well, what does her parentage look like? I can have suspicions, but I can't prove them. So I think, in the early 1900s, when her children are coming of age and starting to think about where they go in the world, that is a time, it's kind of that one drop rule, one African-American grandparent or great-grandparent is enough in American society to identify you that way. And her children are always identified as mixed race on the census. And so I think that must have been kind of a challenging moment for Sarah to be navigating with her children, especially after, right, their father has passed, to say, well, I can't tell you not to marry someone who's not Black or mixed race because she's done it herself. And one of her other daughters does talk about her mother's views on race being as it wasn't of a great concern to her, but she was always very conscious of it, that the world might look a little different to her than it would to someone else. And so it gets into some really interesting questions. Of her descendants that I've talked to, there are descendants who say, yes, I've always identified as a Black person. There was one descendant that I talked to who said, I wasn't aware I had a Black ancestor until I read your book. And so, I think that also brings us a really interesting, complicated American story. And I just always like to throw it out there. Learning about Sarah's story helped me start investigating my story differently. My grandparents were Portuguese, Italian, and Irish. And I was just raised being kind of generically told I was white, like nobody really talked about it when I was growing up. But the 1950 census has just come out. We've just gained access to this as a research tool, and I actually was just looking up my father's family, and they were all marked as other on the 1950 census. And so it definitely gives me a moment to pause and say, okay, well, race is always more complicated in this country than it kind of seems at a surface level, and it's tricky. Oh, sorry, I waxed poetic about that for a long time. I'm not even sure I answered your question, but I do talk about it in the book a lot more. Yes?
Talk about Sarah taking her kids to the World's Fair. What World's Fair was that?
Oh, that's a great question. What World's Fair did Sarah take her children to? I know for sure that they went to the 1905 St. Louis World's Fair. Or 1905 or 1906? 1904, sorry. Thank you.
I know this is so random. Was it in the fall, September?
It is in the book. Okay, excellent. Perfect answer. We can find out. And I find that super, the St. Louis World's Fair is one that just introduces so many things to the world. Like Dr. Pepper makes its debut at an early World's Fair. There are important things being presented.
24th Infantry was stationed in Fort Harrison at the time, Black soldiers, and their U.S. bands selected to perform.
Interesting. I was examining it from the perspective of there is a lot of talk about race and the meaning of race and the classifications of race at the World's Fair, which I was interested in because one of Sarah's daughters ended up attending the University of Chicago, and the best source I have for talking about Sarah Bickford is an undergraduate paper that she wrote in a sociology class at the University of Chicago about her family and their experiences as a mixed-race family on the frontier, which just proves, never throw out those undergrad papers. You never know. It is in here somewhere. I want to say it was in, July or August. So we could look it up. It's somewhere between page 150 and 170. It's always the terrifying moment as the author when you've done your own index and then you have to go look something up. Terror every time. So St. Louis, for sure. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, I was just curious, 'cause it was just recently the anniversary of Loving versus Virginia, which was interracial marriage in the 1960s. So I know that laws it was a long time before that, but can you just talk a little bit about like, interracial marriage and like how, I mean, I assume it was pretty common, but like kind of where that went over time?
It's a great question. So the question is about interracial marriage, and yeah, we've just passed a really important mile marker of the Loving versus Virginia decision that legalized it federally across the country. And there's a great movie about the Loving decision, if anyone hasn't seen it. So both of Sarah's marriages take place before Montana has an anti-miscegenation law on the books. Montana does pass one. It's just a couple years. It's before the turn of the century, but it's just after Sarah's marriage to Stephen Bickford. And it's always kind of tricky in some place like Montana, where interracial marriage has been common, especially if we step back and think of it as being like white fur traders and trappers marrying Native American women, for example. And there's lots of examples of that in Montana history. I'd say like there's always two parts to it, right? You can make the law, you can make whatever law you want, but people following the law is always more complicated. And there's lots of examples of founding fathers of Montana who are married to Native women, for example, like Granville Stewart has a Native American wife, right? That the law is overlooked. So I would guess that it must have been uncomfortable for Sarah at some junctures. What I found was that within Virginia City, they try not to talk about her marriage too much. They just kind of reference that Sarah and Stephen are doing things. But then if I go outward and look at newspapers from Butte or Helena or Deer Lodge, some other places, they're very focused on it being an interracial marriage. There's a little ditty that appears in one of those newspapers about Dick Bickford marrying an African woman in striking color at last. It's in there, it's in the book. So I mean, but it's like human nature too, right? It's so much easier to look at things and think about them in the abstract and think, okay, I'm for or against this in the abstract, and it's so much easier to do that when then it's your neighbor standing right in front of you who's forcing you to think about the abstract in a very human way. And I don't know when Montana's anti-miscegenation law is repealed, but had their marriage come later, I think it might have been quite a bit trickier. Again, I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I'm really trying.
I was thinking like clearly Sarah did a lot of things in life to like create her own power or whatever, but him dying and then, her inheritance or taking on that was a huge source of her power in kind of her history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that was one of the things, I really did have to wrestle with, because it's kind of presented that way over time. It's like, well, she inherited the company, she just happened to like walk into having this water company, and then, she made it work. And that's one of the things I try to argue pretty forcefully for in the book is, no, she had choices. She could have left Montana, she could have sold that company for a really nice sum of money when she inherited it. Like, she had choices. She chose to stay in Virginia City. And I don't think she did any of the things she did, like with the building, or that by accident. So she's making sure that, and she's aware of her place, right? One of the greatest little sources I found about her is from a Chicago publication from the 1920s called The Light and Heebie-Jeebies. That's the name of the periodical. It's very 20s. And Sarah was traveling. She was in Chicago, and she gave an interview to a reporter. She says, "I'm the only woman of my race in the West who's doing this." So she's very aware of being an example. I saw so many hands. I'm so excited to answer questions. I'll come up here.
One thing about the marriage is I think we also have to remember this is a pioneer era, and a lot of the marriages might have been out of necessity, and there wasn't as much of a concern about black and white as there would have been in the 70s, Chicago or some of those places.
There's certainly that sense of maybe it's possible to bend the rules a little bit more in the West because there's not as much oversight. All those systems are still developing. a similar argument to what the vigilantes use, right? Where they're like, well, if we can't have law and order, we'll have order without the law, right? We got to make something work here. So, yes. Oh, so many questions. I'm so excited. I'm getting the look like we have time for maybe like 2 more questions. So we'll go here and then into the back.
I was just going to say, I'm visiting here from
Welcome.
curious if you followed
Oh, I want to so bad. I did a little bit of research about it. I was only able to kind of get so far. It does sound like scandalous. He had a fiance when he came east, and then he was just like, bye. And he doesn't seem to have gone back after that. There's only one case I know of when Stephen Bickford actually went back to Maine to visit his family, and one of his grandchildren tells me it was probably to collect up on his inheritance, and other than that, he wasn't greatly in contact. So this is an amazing question that I have about Stephen Bickford and his side of the family and what they knew or didn't know. It's not actually clear if his family knew that he was married to a black woman and has these 4 mixed-race children. His children know about his family, but it's not clear if they knew about the children. And I would love to follow up on that some more. It's one of those threads that was like, okay, I just have to get this book finished. It has to come out right now, but there's all these other questions I want to follow up on. And I've never been to Maine, so I feel like it's giving me some really good excuses. Oh, so many questions. Okay, I have one back here, and then we'll make time for 3. We'll talk fast. That's a great question. So being born in slavery, how does she come about her knowledge? How does she come to run this business? It's a great question. I can actually give you kind of a quick answer on it. It's not clear how she became literate. When she arrives in Montana, she's clearly literate enough to do some things. How is not clear, but she is. In 1900, when she inherits the water company right after her husband dies, the first thing she does is take a little business correspondence course from Scranton, Pennsylvania. So she sends off for all the materials, and she takes a whole course in business study and earns her little certificate from that school. And her daughter says it's because she's really self-conscious about if she's going to be able to do this on her own. She's probably been running the company for Stephen before that, because he doesn't really seem like the type who would have been content to sit around and manage this water company. He's still off mining for months at a time. But yeah, the International Correspondence School from Scranton, Pennsylvania, I believe. And she takes full advantage of that, and you see it in her pretty meticulous record keeping for the water company, the records of which are here in MHS. Yes, final question.
Is Stephen from Bickford, that town manufacturer?
That's a great question. Is he from Bickford, Maine? I was able to trace where he was from in Maine, and I don't think that was it, but there is like a long line of pretty well-known Bickfords. There's another Bickford in Montana Territory at the same time, also Walter Bickford, who's a pretty well-known name in the Montana history. That early in my research, I would search for Bickford and get all excited, and then it was like not my person. So it's possible, like maybe a couple generations back. His family is certainly long-time, right, residents of Maine. So it's a great question. There's always more connections to uncover.
There's so much more to uncover. And am I right? Sarah was 40 when she was a widow and took ownership?
For the second time, after losing her whole family.
And she had 7 children altogether?
Altogether. Yeah, so it's just you stand there and you're like, I dare you not to be in awe of this woman, right? She did things, and what an inspiration.
Well, thank you so much for talking to us about her today, and can't wait to read the book. And I do believe Laura will be with us all afternoon. I hope you all stay for the ceremony at 3.